I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. As I am each week, joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. And Elizabeth, today we're going to go in depth into a story that we kind of teased in a previous episode. This trial started on Tuesday. Tell me about what we're discussing today.
Yes, we're talking about the Mark Benavides continuous trafficking of persons trial that I followed into Wilson County from Bexar County because there was a change of venue. And wow, there's so much of this story that I could not put into any of our platforms, digital, print, because of the nature of it. Just to remind everybody, this is a former San Antonio attorney who is accused of coercing his clients to have sex with him in exchange for legal services.
And it's not just that, because the accusations that this trial is about are also into trafficking, correct? So explain that specifically. It's not just the sex between the attorney and the client, but there are other things involved.
Well, yes, and that's a very, very good question. Something that other people have been asking me, and something I really would like to get clarified from a judge. But briefly, I was able to get some clarity from one of the prosecutors. I asked the question as to why the feds weren't, conducting this particular case. And it's, when you think about human trafficking, you think really about somebody taken from another country and put into sex slavery, that sort of thing. The reason that it's not a federal case is because it didn't have what I was told as a federal interest. So there's not another country involved, and it's not to that particular level. But according to the indictment here, you use the word trafficked. The indictment states that in these particular cases, in these women, the defendant knowingly trafficked them by using force, fraud, and coercion to cause her to engage in conduct that's prohibited. And they use this penal code section number 43.02 as prostitution.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and I'm glad that you've made that distinction, because it might fit the word of the law, but it's not the way that a lot of people would think of something that would involve that term, trafficking. It's very different, like trafficking, people, trafficking drugs. This is a different context.
Right, exactly. So many intricacies in how the law is written, but yes, this case from the get-go has been just very emotional, very raw, very graphic. The court has not been allowing the gallery to see a lot of what the jury has been seeing now. But back to the particular indictments, along with the accusation that the defendant was having sex with, clients in exchange for legal services, there also were videos taken from these particular encounters. So pretty much from the beginning, when trial started Tuesday, the first couple of witnesses talked about, I'll go right to it. With the jury heard from one of the accusers. Now, there are 6 that are accusing him in this particular case. And when the way this has worked, that whenever the witnesses come and they talk about what their encounters were and what happened, what's alleged to have happened with Mark Benavides, right after they explain, how they were able to, how he became their attorney. A lot of these were court-appointed attorney cases. They were talking about beginning to have sex with him. He would take them to what the prosecutor described as a no-tell motel in the middle of downtown San Antonio, and they would have sex. And afterward, probably after about that first encounter, several of the women who testified said that he would start to videotape their encounters. So right as trial started Tuesday, we hear from an accuser, and then the jury watches the video that has this particular accuser having sex with Mark Benavides. Now, it was so graphic in nature, apparently, that the judge called a break for the jury, and right as they are exiting court, one of the jurors just fainted. And we were probably in recess for probably about an hour and a half after that, but when we came back after lunch, it was a woman who passed out. The judge called her into the court to see how she was doing and to see if she could, continue on. And she just said she was completely overwhelmed with what she saw. And you could tell, because as I was listening and they were watching, these jurors, there were 14 of them seated. You have 12 jurors and 2 alternates. And it's a good thing that they had the alternates, because this woman, you could tell everybody was very, very uncomfortable. And she, in particular, just to me, I noticed she looked very, very upset. So it really wasn't surprising that they needed a break, first of all, but when they got up to leave and she fainted, that was pretty telling that, this was going to be a pretty intense case.
First day of the testimony, correct? I mean, yeah.
Yes, that was first day of testimony, and a alternate became the 12th juror after the woman decided that she could not continue on. And she was extremely apologetic to the judge about it. And he reassured her and said, thank you for doing your duty. We just want to make sure that you're able to do it. And if you can't do it, that's fine. Nothing to worry about, type thing.
And does that mean that now they're down to one alternate, or do they bring in someone else to be the second alternate now? How does that work?
I sit way far away. Media usually sits in the back rows, but from what I can tell, I still see that they have one alternate. So, here's hoping that they won't have to.
Hopefully not like a revolving door with the jurors. Yeah, because that would obviously lead to problems with being able to continue the trial. Before we move on to the next day of testimony, because once again, we've just been talking about what happened Tuesday, I want to go back to a few points you raised that seemed kind of unfortunate, of course, dealing with this entire case. But you mentioned that some of these women, if not all of them, I believe you mentioned, they had this relationship with the defendant because he was their court-appointed attorney. So they were in a situation where they could not afford an attorney, and he was the one they got?
Yes, they have, it's in the Miranda rights, they tell you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, one will be provided for you. And how it works in Bexar County is that when you get arrested, they'll ask you, if you have an attorney. If not, they'll, they read you your rights, and then they'll also remind you, if you don't have an attorney, they can appoint one for you. So they have what they refer to as the wheel, and they have one for defense attorneys. And when it comes up, it comes up. That's the way it's been explained to me. So they can match, defendants with their attorneys. But these women had Mark Benavides representing them in their criminal cases. Many of these cases were prostitution cases, some of them drug cases as well. But the bottom line from, listening to the first accuser on Tuesday, and then later on through the week, listening to the rest, the theme that I keep hearing is that they met with him as their court-appointed attorney. He took them to a motel with the premise that they were going to sign some papers and they were going to talk about the case. And then at some point, they realized, when they get to the room, and he tells them that they're going to have sex with him. And that's what each one we have heard from, I believe, 5 so far. But on Tuesday, we heard from 1. And that was the first time that the video was introduced into court.
And you mentioned with the video, this was not like a hidden camera. The women knew that this was going to be taped, or at least they were told at that time they saw the camera?
The women who testified said that after their first encounter, for the second encounter, we'll say the second encounter, or, maybe the second or third encounter, he introduced a video camera, they testified. And they said he would tell them, what's your name? He would, from what I could hear, it sounded like he was interviewing them while they were getting ready to have relations. He would ask them who they were, whether, their chance. There's so much that I could not write about because there's just no particular way that you can say some of the things that were heard, many of the things that were heard in court on these videos. But he would tell them what to say, what particular sex act he wanted for them to do. And then he told them that he was going to videotape them. And when they asked him, well, why are you going to do this? He said that he told them, they testified, that they were just going to be for him. So when we went into trial on Wednesday, we heard from crime scene investigators, and they detailed things that they, seized as evidence from Benavides' home after he was arrested. And this was a day where there were quite a few things that were revealed. The highlights being that when Benavides was arrested and taken into custody, he spoke a lot to police. In fact, there was one detective who testified this week that he was actually surprised that Mark Benavides spoke to them as much as he did, being that he is a lawyer, because, one of the first things a lawyer will tell you is don't say anything, tell them you want to talk to your lawyer. So he spoke a lot to police. And, whenever you go into an interview room to talk with police, that room is, they record everything that happens in there. I mean, there's a video camera going, and then there's audio. I mean, you can hear at least one half of a phone conversation. And in this particular instance, Benavides was arrested and he was taken into custody. Police, told him what he was arrested for, and he seemed pretty incredulous about it. He kept telling them that he didn't understand the charge, and we talked about this a little bit before, but the charge initially was compelling prostitution. So he said he didn't understand what that was, and as an aside, he told police that he really didn't realize that it was an offense to have sex with your clients. And he said that it happens, I believe the quote was, "It happens all the time at the courthouse." So that proved to be very interesting, because while I was in court, I tweeted out quite a bit of some of this that was happening, and I was getting a lot of responses back from attorneys and from other people saying, no, this doesn't happen all the time. This really isn't something that happens.
Well, in all fairness to Mr. Benavides, I mean, Carlos Uresti, that came out in his trial, and I believe that was after he had already represented a woman who unfortunately had at least one or more children that were killed in a car accident, and then got a settlement because of that. He ended up, at least in that trial, according to that testimony from her, specifically having a sexual relationship with her.
Exactly. I mean, I think I spent a lot of time just with my mouth wide open in this trial, simply because I couldn't believe, that. I mean, I totally could get what the detective was saying on the witness stand, that he was surprised because, he just got very chatty about that, and you'd think that he would know that all of that is under surveillance. So,
especially since he had been representing these women, I mean, they were charged with some of these types of similar crimes, prostitution. I mean, he should have been well versed in this category of crime.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, some of these were felony cases, not just misdemeanors as well. So another big takeaway from Wednesday's testimony was that he asked to make his phone call, and he called and he spoke to his wife, and then he asked to speak to his brother, and he asked his brother to destroy the DVDs that he had, and these were DVDs that they were photographed and they were shown into evidence. When I say that, the DVDs themselves were photographed, and they had been taken from a locked cabinet that was inside his home office. And authorities took 246 mini DVDs and that had video of Benavides having sex with these accusers that authorities considered to be pornographic. All of these videos had the initials of the women that he had sex with and the dates on them. And they also had some codes as to what the particular sexual acts were that were on the video. And it was very disturbing to see just some of the expressions on the faces of the jurors, and of course the accuser, the witness on the stand as well, when they're asked, because they saw these videos before they went on the witness stand to testify. And I mean, to say that they were humiliated is, an understatement. While these videos played, the women on the witness stand, wept silently, held their hands held their head or face in their hands, and they covered their ears with their fingers. I mean, it definitely was not something that they, wanted other people to see. And in fact, there was a question from the defense attorney, Monica Guerrero, asking, did you ever think that this would, that other people would be seeing this video? And they would, she asked a few of them that, and they would reply, well, no, because he said they were just going to be for him.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney.
So, that was a day of a lot of testimony from, crime scene investigators and others who had chain of custody of evidence that was taken from his home. And on Thursday, jurors heard from 4 more accusers and saw 4 more videos that were compilations of many of the 246 mini DVDs that had been recorded with the handheld recorder that was also seized from Benavides' home. So Thursday was a very emotional day because there were, like I said, 4 more accusers and their videos, and some of the women were just very matter of fact about it, that the reason that they participated with, in these alleged encounters was because they didn't, they didn't have any money to retain an attorney, and they felt that if they didn't do what Benavides wanted for them to do, for them to do on the video, that they would either stay in jail the next time they got into jail, or they wouldn't be able to get a bond.
And so once again, if you have a lawyer in a normal, typical sense, there would be an exchange of money for those services. But even if he had been their court-appointed lawyer, where there wouldn't have been that money exchange, they just thought that engaging in this sexual relationship that he had initiated with them would help their case. He would do those things that you mentioned for them. Yes. So even if it wasn't an exchange of money, it was an exchange of better treatment, or things would just go better for them in the future.
Yes. And another big takeaway from Thursday's testimony, again, we heard from 4 people, but 2 of the women that had been represented by Benavides testified that they performed oral sex and did other acts on the man in rooms at a courthouse in Bexar County before they were to meet judges.
Now, this is something we talked about before when we previewed this trial, correct? Which is why the trial got moved, because they didn't want to be using some of the same facilities as where these crimes may have been committed.
Exactly. We learned more with testimony about it this week. They showed photographs of the outside of the 379th State District Court, and 2 rooms on either side of the entrance to the courtroom that at times are used by witnesses, and rooms behind that courtroom near the offices where the jurors meet. Now, this is on the fourth floor of the Cadena Reeves Justice Center in Bexar County, and that is where criminal cases are heard mostly. Before the trial started and when the initial indictments came out in November of 2015 at the time of Benavides' arrest, the arrest warrant affidavit had pointed out that the 399th State District Court and witness and juror rooms in that particular court, which is on the first floor of the Cadena Reeves Justice Center, was also believed to have been places where Benavides had sexual relations with his clients. And so that's new information for me, because when I initially wrote that, those first sets of stories, when news was coming out about this, it was just the 399th State District Court. So now you have two courtrooms in the Justice Center that are said to have been places where sexual relations occurred between Benavides and his clients. So yes, this is the main reason that Benavides' attorney, Monica Guerrero, requested the change of venue. And this was done at a hearing last June before District Judge Dick Alcala, who is presiding over this case. And Guerrero basically said she did not want jurors doing their own investigating because many of these rooms look exactly the same. And just, having that information come out in trial probably would have just been, they wouldn't have been able to, would they have been able to concentrate, while they're in a jury room trying to decide, what's going to happen in this particular case. So that was, they had also had said that, because of the intense media coverage, they wanted to do that. But Judge Alcala decided that he would grant the motion based on the jury and witness room issue in regard to this case.
Yeah, just imagine leaving the main room to have a juror faint and then go into another room where, this is where things supposedly happen. It makes sense why they decided to move things.
Exactly.
Elizabeth, there's so much to talk about, as we've just been proving over the last 25 plus minutes, but we're running out of time. So let's talk about what's coming up this week in this case. I think it doesn't have that much time left. Correct me if that's incorrect. And this charge that the defendant is facing, continuous trafficking of persons, is a first-degree felony punishable by 25 to 99 years or even life in prison. So that's what's at stake here. What can we expect now in this week in this trial?
Well, it will be very interesting. The state may rest their case Tuesday, I'm hearing. And if depending upon what time they do it, if they rest their case Tuesday morning or before lunch, that means that the defense will begin presenting evidence. It could happen it could happen after lunch on Tuesday, or it could happen first thing Wednesday morning. But that's pretty much what it sounds like in during breaks, listening to the court try to schedule, if you will, what witnesses they have coming in, and to try to just, for the judge, to see where they are in this. So whereas, the state has alleged that Mark Benavides, and it was just to kind of point it out, it's because I thought this was a very powerful comment from opening statements. from Meredith Chucklin, who is the lead prosecutor. She said in her opening statement that Benavides used our justice system to acquire women. What we're probably going to see coming up next from the defense, based on some of their cross-examination that I've heard already, they're going to really heavily try to suggest that these sexual encounters were consensual and that the women were not forced. The thing that's also going with that probably they will point out pretty heavily is that all of these women have history of addiction. Many of them have been addicted to or are still dealing with heroin addictions, methamphetamine. We heard a lot about ice last week. So this week, as the defense begins to put their case on, I think they're going to throw out some things. They're probably going to make things a little interesting for the jury to decide in all of this, because you get to hear one side first, and then you get to hear the other one, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens here, which way this goes.
Yeah, obviously still time left on this one. Perhaps next week we'll have some final thoughts on this, Elizabeth. But yeah, we have gone very in-depth on this case. I appreciate the kids' gloves, if you will, that you've been using to discuss this topic, because, obviously some of this stuff's very not appropriate for a lot of people. And as we pointed out, a juror ended up fainting, being excused from the trial. So this is not the typical case that we have talked about here on the docket, and that's great that we can discuss it. But obviously, some tough subject material for a lot of people out there. So thank you once again to Elizabeth Zavala for joining me, as she does every week here on the docket. Elizabeth, good luck with this case this week, and we'll talk again at the end of the week.
Thank you very much, Chance.
And, of course, big thanks, as always, to San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.